So inside of Zoom, it does say that we're live.
Okay. And can you see
Inside of Zoom, it does say that we're live.
Okay. Okay, I think we're ready. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Conversations in Black, Life in a Burning House and the Artist's Struggle for Liberation. Conversations in Black is a space facilitated by Musings from the Lighthouse that brings together Black artists and cultural custodians who demonstrate a commitment to the liberation of Black bodies. My name is Karla Felecia Scaife, and as founder of Musings from the Lighthouse, I will be acting as this conversation's facilitator. In this space, we are intentional about the way that we communicate thoughts and ideas with one another. We intend for our language to be as accessible as possible by not allowing the specialized jargon of our individual disciplines to hinder clear communication. We demonstrate mutual respect for one another by being active listeners and offering thoughtful responses. We try our best to refrain from using ableist language or language that is not gender inclusive, and we affirm the right of each participant to only discuss what they feel safe in offering to the conversation. This particular conversation is the first installment of a series that we hope will continue indefinitely. This evening, we are inspired by a metaphor used by Martin Luther King Jr. to describe life in America for bodies dwelling in marginalized spaces, particularly Black and poor bodies. A burning house is what he called it. There is an album coming out Saturday that just so happens to be inspired by and named after the metaphor King used to describe marginalized life. It's my album, and when I was first writing about it, I described it as a conversation about Black struggle and liberation that is focused on privileging parts of our stories that are left out of mainstream narratives. And so the question becomes, how do we use narrative as a tool of resistance as artists in our own respective lanes? We tell the truth. We tell the truth about how life has really been like living in the burning house of this country, as well as within our own burning bodies that carry generations of unresolved trauma from centuries of oppression. And we do this with our art. So this evening, we're going to grapple together with the cost of truth-telling. Shout out to Candace Bimbo, who wrote an excellent article about that very idea in regard to Jada Pinkett Smith. That's the inspiration of this evening's focus. What keeps us from telling the truth? What are we risking and what are we gaining? So here to grapple with this idea are four friends of mine that I respect and love dearly. We have Julia McCorvey, Erica Joy Johnson, Quentin Cox, and Satoya Foster. I am truly grateful to each of you for accepting the invitation to talk with us this evening. And I will refrain from gushing, because I will, and instead we'll let each of them introduce themselves. But first, let's take just a brief moment to center ourselves. So if you would, please take this time to be silent and take in a few breaths. If you have some sage, light it, because that's what I'm doing. As we continue breathing, let us remember our intentions, the worth of our bodies, and the power of our stories. Ashe. Okay, now we'll do the introductions, and we will begin with Quentin, then Julia, then Erica, and then Satoya.
Good evening. I am Quentin Cox, and let me begin by saying thank you to Karla for the invitation and the opportunity to share this evening. I think you already know what I think about your work, your words, your music, all that you create. But I think also creating this space and this time to have this conversation is incredibly important. So thank you so much for your continued efforts at helping us to grapple with things that matter the most in our lives and in the world around us. So I'm Quentin. I'm a third year divinity school student at Vanderbilt Divinity School, but I'm also involved in photography, videography, and most recently some documentarian work. And I think how that intersects our time this evening is that documentaries and photographs and video in many cases are ways wherein we can capture truth and where we can record life as it's happening, record our understanding of life as it's happening, that we might preserve it to be able to share it with others at some point in time in the future. So that's sort of where I enter into this conversation and into this work. As it relates to the movement for liberation, I think it's incredibly important that we own our stories and own our narratives. I think part of what has happened in this country, especially to Black people, is that our narrative has been shaped by non-Black people that had malintent, non-Black people that had white supremacist agendas, ideas, and motives. And taking those narratives back and retelling our stories in ways that are life-giving to us, that are truth-preserving, that expose sort of the traumas and the difficulties that our people have endured and are enduring, is not only liberative, but it's powerful, it's freeing. I mean, there's so many things that that work does and can do. And so I'm excited, again, to share on this evening and to be a part of this conversation about reclaiming our narratives and the power therein.
Thank you. Next, we will have Julia.
Hello, everyone. And I'll echo that gratitude to Karla for being so open with this space and for being such a wonderful conversation partner. I am Julia McCorvey. My pronouns are she and her. I am a native Kentuckian. I am a child of musicians. I am a violinist myself, and right now I work as a professional fundraiser in a small town in the mountains of Colorado. And my studies have always been about people. I love people. I've studied psychology, theology, Spanish, and now I'm in the business of having and helping people turn their passion and their support for art into donations. And something I believe deeply is that we all have our own unique chord that adds to sort of the chorus of life. And I believe that with my whole heart, but I think something that has happened over the years is that I learned not only to be silent, but I learned from the world and from white supremacy how to silence myself so that no one else had to do it. I knew how to keep quiet. And so I'm so excited for this opportunity to be in this conversation with so many wonderful thinkers and friends and human beings. And yeah, eager to see how this evening goes.
Thank you for being here. Now we will have Erica.
Hello, everyone. My name is Erica Joy. I use she, her pronouns. And I also want to thank Karla for this invitation. You know, when you send your friend an article, she makes you talk about it. And I wanted to hear what she had to think. And here we are on this panel. But part of why I'm really excited to be here tonight is because I think a lot about bodies and flesh, the things that the body knows. And so often when we talk about sensory knowledge, we talk about something that our bodies literally feel. And yet we know that there are many different kinds of bodies in our world. And so when we talk about flesh knowledge, it's a little bit different, right? Like our bodies can know things that they may or may not be able to feel. And I think about that a lot in terms of what our bodies know about anti-Blackness, what our bodies know about white supremacy, but also what our bodies know about freedom. What our bodies know about healing space. I was in a conference last week where Ashley Henderson, who is the co-director at the Highlander Center, said that I am at my best with a relaxed body. And I think that is what this space is. It is a relaxed body. Because when we are relaxed, then we know that that house is burning. But we also see that the world outside the house is also burning. We're not just attuned to our own moment of crisis. And so thank you for being here, and I'm excited for tonight.
Thank you, Erica. Lastly, we will have Satoya.
Hi, I'm Satoya. And as everyone has also echoed, thank you so much for creating this space for us to have this dialogue. And you know how I feel about you, so I'm not gonna gush either, though I could. So I'm Satoya. I'm an artist, a writer, a trauma recovery advocate, and very passionate about facilitating redemption. And so I've worked in various ministries and nonprofits over the last 18 years. And my work has mostly been focused on trauma, healing, and recovery through art and the Enneagram, and carving out sacred space for others to engage their liberation and their healing process. And I think it's important to engage that with radical honesty and embodiment, like being able to engage that in and with our bodies.
Thank you, Satoya. And thank you all so much. Now we will go into our discussion. We have 5 questions that we wanted each of our conversation partners to engage. And our conversation partners are not limited to who you see on the screen. Whoever's watching out there in the crowd, you're also a conversation partner. So if you have a question or you would like to offer your truth, please feel free to leave a comment and we will talk about it at the end of the discussion. Our questions are as follows. What narratives have you felt most called or burdened to challenge in your work? What conflicts arise internally and with others when you have challenged them? What were the risks of leaving these narratives unchallenged? What were the risks of challenging them? Has it been more effective to grapple with these issues in community or in isolation? And so we'll be answering these questions in the same order as the introductions were offered. So Quentin, I pose the first question to you again. What narratives have you felt most called or burdened to challenge in your work?
Yeah, thanks, Karla. So when I first read this question, boy, it was hard to sort of narrow it down to one or even to a small number of narratives, because it seems as though there are so many narratives that are what I would say false, but more importantly, that are harm dealing, if not death dealing, toward folks in my community. But in an effort to sort of narrow down and think about my work and think about what it is that I really want to stand for and want people to understand, I do think that there is this narrative that we as Black people have something to be ashamed of, that we as Black people are a problem in our society. And that may be a hard sort of narrative to wrap our minds around. It may be difficult to sort of conceptualize how someone may feel that that is what is out there sort of in the world for Black people to consume and to digest. But this isn't a new idea whatsoever, right? When we think about W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington and other thinkers at the end of the 19th century, there were folks grappling with this idea called the problem of the Negro, or the Negro problem. There were essays written discussing sort of what it meant to be Black, and why was it that Black was a problem for the rest of America to sort of navigate and to deal with. And I think that it's a narrative that persists today. I think we see the narrative play out on news stories across media spectrums. I think we see it play out in our personal interactions, within our own community. I think we see it play out in interactions outside of our community. There is this idea that Black people are a problem for others. And quite frankly, there's this idea that Black people are a problem even for ourselves. And for me and my work, right, what I want to do is I want to tell the stories that demonstrate that there is no Negro problem, that Black people are not problematic in any way, shape, or form, that the human condition, right, that in our humanity, we all have struggles, we all have difficulties, we all have things that may not be good, right, pleasant, fun, whatever you want to call it. But to suggest or to say that there is a Negro problem or that Black people are a problem in America for non-Black folk is a narrative that I just can't sit well with. I think about, as I do this work, I think about Muhammad Ali, Cassius Clay, who spent much of his public life affirming Black folk. Everywhere that you would see him talk about his people, talk about himself, it was an absolutely an unapologetic, bold statement about the beauty, the bravery, the boldness that was Black and Black people. And so for me, that is the narrative that I want to support. I want to capture the ways in which Black people are being amazing, because there are a ton of ways that Black people are being amazing. And I want those stories to dominate what we're seeing, what we're believing, what we're hearing.
Thank you. Does anyone have a response to what Quentin said?
I just want to say that I think it's so important that you bring up Muhammad Ali, because earlier today or yesterday, his son came out and said that his father would not have supported Black Lives Matter. And he called it he called the movement all sorts of names are false about it. But I think that is what the anti-Blackness that's in the air can do, right? It can corrupt that legacy. And it can also cause us to say things that feel really contradictory to what we know. And so I just thank you for bringing that up, Quentin.
Thank you. Anyone else?
I'll jump into, Erica, I loved your words of what's in the air, because I think one of the narratives I think of often is the way we internalize the narrative that we are not enough, that what we have isn't enough, that your money is good here, it's not good here, and that there is a specific box that you have to be the right kind of skin tone, and then even within that, you have to be the right kind of Black, you have to be the right kind of embodied person that you are, and if not, you are shut down, and there is no place for you here, when in fact that is not true. I mean, we are taught and socialized to believe that that there is not enough space, that there can be no sharing, and it's so beautiful to act to the contrary of that and to realize how false that story is. But that's something that I find myself grappling with often, is the way we've learned about what is enough.
Does anyone have a response? Okay, and I'm sorry, did you have more to add to the first question as well, Julia?
Nope, I'm good.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure before we go to the next person. Thank you. Okay, now, Erica, I asked the same question to you. What narratives have you felt most called or burdened to challenge in your work?
Sure. I also realized I don't think I ever said what my work was. I got excited. So I am a student, but I also am a writer and a painter. And so for me, as a multiracial Black woman, challenging anti-Blackness is not only really important to me, but I think that it's critical to disrupt like racial identity as a tool of proximity to whiteness. And what I mean by that is that so often biracial or multiracial or racially ambiguous folks use their racial identity as the softer version of Blackness, or the softer, more palatable version of what exists in what Emily Towns calls the fantastic hegemonic imagination, or what Frank Thomas calls the diabolical imagination, or what we could just call the stuff that people have made up and is the air that we breathe about Black people. And so for me, that's really important to challenge, as well as narratives surrounding trauma and violence. And so I think about those things. If everybody has a story, and your trauma narrative isn't the summation of one's being, how do we honor what has happened and move forward into the places that we are called to be? And so I think those are the things I think about.
Thank you, Erica. Does anyone have a response to that? If not, we will move to Satoya, and I will ask that question to you. What narratives have you felt most called or burdened to challenge in your work?
I feel the most called to challenge perceptions and interactions around trauma, especially complex trauma, and the ways that we interact both individually and collectively, and the ways that we can better facilitate processes of healing. And I think that that takes radical honesty and very intentional engagement. For me personally, as a Black woman, as a Jamaican American, also like adding in that cultural component, it's important to me that Black people have safe spaces to engage the traumatic events that we've experienced, and then to reclaim our sense of self outside of the narratives that are imposed on us. And I think that we also need places to be able to do that with people that can reflect our experiences back to us.
Thank you. Does anyone have a response? If not, I have a response. That's actually another question, and I know we're not prepared for this, but Satoya, you mentioned about safe space. And I'm wondering if we could take a few moments to imagine what that might look like. If we could conjure together some kind of utopia of safety, what would it look like? What systems of accountability would be in place?
When I think of safe space, I think in a lot of ways it can be incredibly self-defining for a lot of people. When I think about safe space, I think about conjuring that within myself, but that's also with me having a personal background with trauma and with complex trauma. And so it's important to me that I feel at home in my body. And I think being in a culture that has the, as Erica was saying, the air of anti-Blackness, that it's important for me to own my Blackness, for me to own my experiences, and for me to be able to live here and feel grounded here. So that's how I perceive safety.
Yeah, I think similarly, when I think about safe space, I think about this, again, this whole notion of sort of truth telling, being able to show up and to know the truth that you know, and to not have to deny the truth that you know. I think about safe space in a communal context. And I think about safe space as not necessarily meaning that there isn't harm that's done, or that there isn't kind of a messy, difficult thing that has to be walked through, but that there are boundaries and supports and accountabilities in place to help people sort of navigate through the messiness of it all. That any time that we deal with truth, it can be difficult, it can be hard. It's also necessary, again, as are, to me, these communal elements of guidance, protection, and accountability for all folks involved in that conversation.
I'll volunteer that I think there's also something about showing up in a space and being able to shed some of the maybe tools isn't the right word, but the defenses you've built up that you need in order to say, like, I don't need to be defensive here. I don't need to already be silent in advance. I don't have to prepare for the worst when I show up here, because I know my truth in this place is valid and that it's not going to be immediately cut down or harmed when I offer it.
That reminds me of a song that Erica introduced me to, Sacred Space by India Ari. And the lyrics, one of my favorite lyrics of the song, India says, "When life becomes a fight, you are where I put my gloves down." And it's just something about that line that just, it does something for me, just to be able to imagine a space where you can just put your gloves down and not have to worry about, you know, what's going to happen as a result, or what's going to happen when you have your gloves down. So.
I think when I imagine that kind of safety, a phrase you hear often in movements these days is the idea that we keep us safe. And so often I think that we are taught to go get somebody to keep us safe. And oftentimes that's not the police. It could just be a teacher. It could be, you know, a relative. It could be whoever, somebody who you've given authority to. But sometimes I think that safety means that we are accountable to one another. But sometimes safety means that we tell the truth to one another and not just the person who's in authority. And that goes across lots of different instances, whether that's about pay equity, right? Like, if I don't know that you get paid more than me, then I'll never know that you get paid more than me. All the way down to this violence that's being committed against me, whether it's systemic or individual, is also probably being perpetrated against somebody else. And so safety not only demands truth, both like becoming home in ourselves, but also naming each other as home.
Thank you for that. Okay, let's try to get to the second question. Quentin, what conflicts have arisen internally and with others when you have challenged these narratives?
Yeah, great question. So as I think about white supremacism, this sort of phrase comes to mind, right? That white supremacism and racism is to America and Americans what water is to fish. That is, A, we are constantly surrounded by it, and B, it is necessary for the lives that we have lived and maintained for so long. And so for me internally, I think the first thing that I began to realize and to be conflicted by was the ways wherein I either benefited from or was complicit in white supremacism. Not that I ever intentionally did harm to Black people or to any person because of race or because of these ideas, but beginning to sort of unravel and beginning to see how I have participated in these systems, whether in a workplace, whether in an academic environment, whether in quests or pursuits for well-being and success for my household, for my family, or my career. There are just ways wherein we have all adopted some piece of white supremacism. Again, it's in our curriculum. It's what we learn in schools. It is the systems that we use at work. It is what we see in the media. We are inundated day in and day out, 24/7 in this country with the ways of white supremacism. And so for me, that was the first internal conflict, was beginning to sort of see those ways wherein I was connected to or participating in those systems, and then needing to find ways to loosen myself from those, to separate from those ways of seeing the world and understanding the world, and to begin adopting new ways of thinking about things and understanding the world. So I'll give you an example that's one of my favorite examples. I use a laundry detergent called True, True. And you can find it on Amazon. And it's produced by a Black company. And I love it. And I can't tell you the number of Black people that I've talked to about this laundry detergent. And to a T, every time, and it's sort of a communal joke, but not really. Every time that I mention to someone that I'm using this laundry detergent that's created by a Black company, Black people respond, and the first thing they say is, "Man, did it mess your clothes up?" Right? And it's joking and it's in jest, but it's also connecting to this idea that if it's created by a Black person, then it's maybe a little bit less stable, maybe not as good, maybe inferior in some way, shape, or form. And so we latch on to these ways of thinking, right, without even necessarily knowing that that's exactly what it is. And so for me, right, identifying those and divesting myself of those has been an important part of this work and this journey for me. To answer that question kind of interpersonally, man, when you start dealing with the truth and truths that people don't want to talk about, it's a fight. Both Black people and white people and others who, again, benefit from these systems and are vested in these systems, find it very difficult to begin reckoning with ways in which these systems are doing harm. And because it becomes difficult to reconcile how these systems are doing harm, you want to defend these systems as part of who you are, right? It is the American way to be racist, even though we don't necessarily know how to do that. So that's my initial thought to the questions of where do those conflicts arise for me around these narratives that exist.
Thank you for that. Julia, what conflicts arise within, internally, and with others when you've challenged problematic narratives?
Thanks. So I think a big thing that comes up first is discomfort, of course. of reckoning with something and realizing, as Quentin said, the ways that you're complicit. And also, I think there's something of recognizing what you didn't even know. I am a person who loves control. And so the idea that there is this system and I can't control it, so I might as well live into it because I know how it works, is one of those internal reckonings. And then when you bring it externally and with others, there is the discomfort and there's also fear. We don't know how this is going to work if we try to tear it down. We don't know what's going to come. We don't know if we'll survive. And I think part of one of the challenges I mentioned was like the feeling of being enough. And I think partnered with that is accessibility of, well, you're not good enough, so you can't reach this extra place, this extra special location or destination because you didn't make it past the checkpoint. I know that as someone who is tasked with funding an organization, I have to know which individuals, which organizations, which foundations are going to help us get to that goal. And so it's very easy to forget the smaller donations, the smaller efforts, the smaller things, which doesn't mean they're no good, but it's when we think of like what our ultimate goal is, it makes it difficult to see how those fit into that narrative. Having studied psychology, a term that I grew to love was cognitive dissonance, which is the idea that you can't hold two opposing ideas at once to be true. And I think that's sort of where we live in trying to hold both things to be true at the same time when one of them is not, and we're trying to reconcile that. And I know that that is sort of where I find that friction of and that tension, that unsafety is in trying to reckon two things, knowing whether one is true or not. So I think, yeah, the interpersonal and the internal challenge or conflicts I find are with that fear, that lack of knowing, which can sometimes escalate to not just being uncomfortable, but being in a state of distress. So I think those are some things that arise for me.
Thank you for that. Erica, what narratives have you felt most called or I'm sorry, that's the first question, I'm sorry. What conflicts arise within and with others when you have challenged problematic narratives?
I would echo a lot of the things that Julia just said. I think that personally, within my own family, because my mother was white and now is with the ancestors, I think that there is this tension sometimes where I don't want to do or say something that dishonors her. And knowing that telling the truth is more important than maintaining a false sense of like image, but that there is that tension there, particularly because she has gone on, right? And so there isn't that like relationality that is continued. And so that's one of them for me. And then the other is that challenging these narratives is ongoing, right? Like you can't just do it one day and be like, well, I told the truth today, so tomorrow I'm just going to be quiet. Like once you start, I find that it is harder to be quiet. And I think that in some ways, like we don't have a choice, that liberation demands the truth, but that doesn't make it less exhausting to do.
Thank you, Erica. Before we move on to Satoya, I want to ask this question. Is there room for consent, you think? When it comes to that, that messy thing of telling the truth and, being exhausted because the work is exhausting. So.
I do think that the second I said that we don't have a choice, I was like, Karla's gonna call me out on it. I think that the work of liberation is not something that we do alone. And it also is not something that should be unsustainable, right? And so it's part of why I believe that truth telling happens in community, because sometimes we have to tag out. And if we are in relationship with other people, someone else ought to tag in so that we can rest. It's why I believe deeply in the idea of Sabbath. And so I do think that there is a role for consent. I do think that we make a decision every single moment of every single day. But I also think those decisions cost us. And sometimes the cost of not saying something is as great as the cost of saying something.
Thank you. Anyone else? I want to respond to that question of consent. If not, we'll move to Satoya. What conflicts arise within and with others when you have challenged problematic narratives?
So when I think of these topics, my brain and my body immediately goes to trauma because that's where I live. And I know there's an inherent conflict because that in and of itself is not an easy topic for people to grapple with. Because trauma work involves a lot of change, and with that, a lot of grief. And as all the conversationalists have said on here, like we've talked a lot about truth and uncovering truth, and in that sometimes we see things in ourselves and in others that we don't like. And so Quentin talked a little bit about like his interaction under white supremacy, and I found that like I've had to be honest about the ways that I've upheld white supremacy, like minimizing myself in white spaces because I felt unsafe in my body, from, changing my voice because like you apply for a job and I mean, my name's already Satoya. So it's just like, if they do call me back, then making my voice sound a little bit higher and less threatening, not wearing my door knockers because I don't want to appear aggressive. And so basically it leads to this internal conflict where I have to, or I felt like I have to negotiate, or I have to negotiate losing a sense of myself. But then there's conflict on the flip side where in attempts to reclaim myself, I end up disrupting the comfort of white people around me within the community. And so that internal conflict around negotiating what I say or what I don't say, and trying to decide what may feel worth it in the moment is exhausting.
Thank you. That leads us into our third question, actually. What are the risks of leaving these narratives unchallenged? Quentin, so I ask you first.
Yeah, to kind of pick up where Satoya left off there, this whole idea of engaging these narratives and challenging these narratives creates this disruption, right? So in many ways, the reality is that leaving these narratives alone can oftentimes be more comfortable and easier and less messy in life and less complicated. It can seem as though the risk lies with engaging these narratives and trying to dismantle them or trying to undermine them or trying to expose them. And that's true to a certain degree. But I think the bigger reality, right, the bigger truth in this is that if we don't do something about these narratives, if we don't stand up and begin talking about and challenging these narratives that would suggest, for example, that there is a Negro problem, then we allow ourselves, right, those folks who are oppressed or who suffer the consequence of those narratives to, number one, continue to suffer those. We allow ourselves to continue to sort of have this trauma heaped onto us that's related to these narratives, because that's the problem with the narratives. The narratives aren't bad because they are words. The narratives are bad because they are words that lead to ideas and beliefs that then lead to actions and ways that people show up in the world. And because when these narratives, when these ideas, these words go unchallenged and these beliefs are allowed to persist, then it allows people to show up in the world in ways that, to Erica's point earlier, then has an impact on my physical body. Whether it is a lynching of a Black person for no reason, whether it is the state, agents of the state acting and doing harm against bodies in protest, whether it is some kind of conflict that takes place in a work environment or in a mall or anywhere that could take place, right? So not challenging these narratives means that we allow these ideas to continue to persist. And then that allows for this continued trauma to be heaped upon the bodies of the oppressed. And in particular, we're talking about the bodies and lives of Black folk. And so for me, that's the cost, right? That's what's at risk here, is that we allow ourselves to continue to be traumatized, and not just ourselves, we allow future generations to be continually traumatized as well.
Thank you. Julia, what are the risks of leaving these narratives unchallenged?
So I think one of the risks of leaving them unchallenged, I've been thinking in this question about naming things, of knowing even what you are up against, that if you don't name it, you don't even know what's hurting you. And you don't know if you are recreating it for others, that, as Satoya said, of minimizing yourself. And then as I minimize myself, am I then asking someone else to come into a very small space? Am I asking them to be small too? Am I going against the committed things I say I believe, that I believe everyone belongs here, that I believe these things, and I'm asking others to act contrarily as well. And I think there's also part of that community component and that personal component is our wholeness being at risk, that we are so many different fragmented selves with so many different, in so many different spaces, that we don't even realize how broken we can or have become. And that is painful, it is distressing. I know I had a moment where there was an opportunity where people could say, how are you doing today? We all kind of round robined it. And hearing different folks say, oh, well, the state of the world today is bringing me down. The state of the world is bringing me down. And I was surrounded by these white bodies, and I thought to myself, I don't have the luxury of saying the state of the world is bringing me down. And I had this dissonance of, do I say that being Black is really hard today, or do I stay quiet right now? And that fragmented conversation in my own self brought me to panic. And so I won't say that that's definitely what happens for others, but I'm sure that there are things like that do, of trying to reconcile so many different pieces that you just don't even know how to reconstruct.
Thank you. Erica, what are the risks of leaving these narratives unchallenged?
I love that we were just talking about taking up space, because one of my favorite lines from Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth, in the very first chapter, he talks about how the colonized person's town, the town that belongs to them, is a world without spaciousness. And that line has never left me, because I think the risk of leaving narratives unchallenged means that that space gets even tighter. Right? The air, we've talked about the air tonight, how it's thick and how it's hard to breathe in, which is all the more relevant right now. Like, we're in a pandemic that has to do with the lungs. That has to do with our very breath spreading to one another. And yet this idea that it could get tighter, that there could be less space, not only for us, but for the next generations, for the little children who we see when we walk down the street. I think that for me is what the risk is. It's about spaciousness.
Thank you, Erica. Satoya, what are the risks of leaving these narratives unchallenged?
I think that, well, let me say this first. I think that if we're going to pursue any healing of any kind, it begins with looking inward and outward. And we have to engage these narratives because it informs our actions and our core beliefs and how we interact with others and ourselves. But I think to leave these narratives unchallenged, it allows toxic patterns of behavior and thinking to continue. And I think that, like, in the middle of everything that's going on right now and historically, there's too much at risk. Yeah, this is a really hard question for me because I think it brings my mind and my body back to feelings of negotiation, but elevating the importance of still being present enough to challenge where possible. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm picking up recurring themes of continuity and disruption. So I just kind of wanted to put that out in the air as we continue to think about the rest of these questions. What we allow to continue, what is disrupting, what we're disrupting. Quentin, what are the risks of challenging them, of these problematic narratives? I know we've been kind of hinting at that the entire time, but what are the risks of challenging these problematic narratives?
Yeah, I think the reality is that the risk is just different traumas. And I think it's important to say it that way for me because not challenging these narratives, right, opens the door for trauma. We've talked about that, right? We all understand the multitude of traumas that come with allowing white supremacist ideologies to go unchecked or unchallenged. But we have to recognize that challenging these ideologies it's just going to create different traumas, at least in the short run. Those traumas might look like disconnection, broken relationships, isolation, rejection. I mean, there's a whole host of things that will likely come when folks begin standing up and calling out these issues. And we have to understand that these issues are supported not just by individuals, these issues are supported by systems and by empires. And so to stand up and to call these narratives what they are, and to talk about these narratives in challenging ways or very public ways, is to literally then stand up and challenge the very fundamental foundation of many of the systems and the institutions of our society, right? If it is true that white supremacism is to Americans what water is to fish, and our lives are very much dependent upon these systems, then we are fundamentally challenging the entire way of thinking, living, being, and existing in this country to challenge these narratives. And so to think that there would not be risks, I think, would be extremely naive. And to understand that those risks will lay at your feet and that they may come both interpersonally, but they also may come beyond kind of the interpersonal realm, where empire, begins to seek to find ways to limit this narrative or to stomp out this narrative and to prevent it from going forward. So I think there's a lot of risks.
Thank you. Julia, what are the risks of challenging problematic narratives?
So I was thinking two things about this question. The first was sort of about our conversations about the truth. And so I thought to myself, and what am I obligated to do if this is true? Can I continue living the way I live if it is true that we live in a white supremacist system? Can I do the work I do if it is true that it is built on economic inequality? Can I? So there's sort of a sacrifice of what am I sacrificing when I allow this to be true, and what unknown am I moving towards if I admit that it is true? And then the other thing I thought about was when I read this question, I thought of the psalmist saying, though I walk through the valley of death. And I just thought to myself, we're walking through this valley of death, of trauma against trauma, that I am not going to get to the other side without having seen some things, without having changed, without having reckoned with my own life and the lives of those around me. And so I think the risk of challenging, while I hope that on the other end, I am the most free person I have ever become, surrounded by the most free people who have ever been around me. I think that there is a lot of walking through a valley of death and walking through a valley of trauma to get there.
Thank you. Erica, what are the risks of challenging these problematic narratives?
I really appreciate the reminders that it's different traumas and of the valley of death. When I heard this question, I've been thinking about double dutch. I grew up double dutching outside. I don't think that's how you say it, but I just did. And, you watch the ropes go in and you're counting to jump in. And once you're inside, which seems like the hardest part at first, you have to keep up because the ropes get faster and faster. And if you're from where I'm from, then people start doing like little hand clapping games inside them, and I cannot do any of them anymore. And then you have to get out. But the ropes don't always slow down, and you're trying to get out so somebody else can jump in. And that for me sort of feels like the moment that we're in, where you just keep jumping and like praying that those ropes slow down so that you can jump out and you don't trip and fall in front of everyone. And so in addition to all of the risks that I think everyone else has named, I also think that there's this piece of relationality, that we don't get to challenge a narrative without being in relationship with somebody else. And hopefully being in relationship with multiple people in some form or fashion. And so knowing that being known in that way has a cost. And sometimes I say that I have the capacity to be known in that way, but I lack the courage. And I think that for me, apart from the looming shadows of death or knowing that more harm is coming, I think the fear of being known and then being walked away from because you were known is the scariest risk of all of them to me.
Thank you, Erica. Satoya, what are the risks of challenging problematic narratives?
It's like Erica just like pulled out my journal or something with that last phrase. Like I was thinking of the words vulnerability and allowing, and how hard that is. I think that the work comes at a cost. And it puts me in the mind frame of Quentin talking about trading off one trauma for another. And it really truly does come at a cost for me, for people to hold people accountable, or to interrupt toxic patterns of behaviors or thinking. It means to interrupt life, or the life that I know and the relationships that I have. And all the embedded beliefs about myself or others, or the mythology of America, like everything is called into question. But the recognition that without the work, there's no liberation. It feels very heavy. Yeah, I think right now I'm kind of just trying to sit with my body right now, and I feel the weight of it as we're having the conversation. But I think that to be liberated is to grapple wholeheartedly and honestly with systems and structures that attempt to keep us from freedom, and like rejecting the notion of people's opinions about the time that has passed since like get over it, or it happened so long ago, or whatever else. I think that we're worth more and we deserve more. And navigating my beliefs about our inherent value as people, but then also having the courage to be vulnerable and to allow community to step into that. It's a hard question. I don't have a perfect answer, but I think that's my best current answer.
Thank you for that. Our last question. Has it been more effective to grapple with these issues in community or in isolation?
Ooh. Yeah, that's a great question. I have grappled with these issues both in community and in isolation. Let's just be clear, first of all, that grappling with these issues is not fun or easy at all. And I don't know that either mode, for me anyway, has been any easier or more difficult than the other. As we've talked about, right? Most slave masters didn't want slavery to end. And there were enslaved people who didn't necessarily have a vision for slavery ending either. So not everyone understands liberation or wants to support the idea of liberation, and that can be difficult. And so in community now, right, there are folks who don't necessarily fully understand these issues of white supremacism that exist in our society. There are Black folk who don't fully understand. There are white folk who don't fully understand. And having these conversations, grappling with these issues in those communities can be very hard and very draining. It can also be rewarding, especially when people begin to see and understand and begin to show up differently in the world based on the conversations that are taking place. But it's very difficult. Likewise, doing this work alone in isolation, that's for the birds too. And so I guess I would say perhaps, it is finding, your tribe. So there are, for example, 5 of us on this call, and we can have these conversations and we can do this work together because we're like-minded and we have an orientation to these ideas and to this way of thinking. Understanding that community sometimes, when dealing with these kinds of issues, needs to be very small. It needs to be very intimate and needs to be a place where, again, we've talked about, being able to show up as your full self with your full beliefs, your full ideas, having space for those ideas to be able to exist, perhaps to be challenged and to be molded and shaped and to be shifted. But to do all of that work with people who know you, who love you, who you know, who you love, who have your best interest at heart and whose best interest you also hold dear. I think that if you can find that, that's a treasure. And if you can do the work in that environment, that's probably, for me anyway, the most effective and best way to try to do this work.
Thank you. Julia, has it been more effective to grapple with these issues in community or in isolation?
So I'll admit, when I first heard the question, I was thinking about quarantining and the pandemic and being alone in my house. And as I heard Quentin, I started to sort of shift a little bit in my thinking, although I will answer sort of a little bit of both. That one of the things that I have been able to do alone during the pandemic is to find community in these online spaces, because I know, at least where I am, that physical community of other Black folk doesn't really exist, or it's very small, I should say. And so finding and realizing that this work is not something that should be done by one person without support has led me to finding articles, blog spaces, authors, and having those voices as community has been so eye-opening, because I know for myself, when I read a Black poet, whether they're saying something that I know or not, I feel connected in a unique way. And so I feel like having that aloneness, at least physically, at least in this current context, makes it easier to take stock of my surroundings and the community I have around me. but I do agree with Quentin that doing it by yourself is not, it's just not, it's for the birds, as you said. That when you are finding yourself breaking down, having no one around to help you build yourself back up is just not something I would wish on anyone else. And so I think doing personal work is critical. And I think doing the community work is also incredibly valuable, especially seeing all these protests that have cropped up and have always been brewing, and finding accountability partners who you never will know, but know that you're working with and want to work with.
Thank you, Julia. Erica, has it been more effective to grapple with these issues in community or in isolation?
The womanist in me quotes Alice Walker saying that I'm a separatist only for self-care. The other parts of me say that having a political home is really important. That I can get somewhere by myself. I can read all of the books. And those who know me know I read most of the books. But political homes teach us how to ask questions. They give us critical lenses and frameworks to understand the world. And when you're in the right one, you're around people who are much more radical than you. And I find that abrasion, the rubbing up against in the questions, in the conversation, for me has been really formative. I would argue that using the language of creation, that like we are created to be in community, that we learn best from one another. And that sometimes we have to go away to process. I think of my time with my therapist as isolation, but others think of their time with themselves as isolation. And I think that both can be fruitful. And perhaps both are necessary.
Thank you, Erica. Satoya, has it been more effective to grapple with these issues in community or in isolation?
Yeah, so that's a really hard question. I was telling you this earlier, that when I read that, I was like, ugh. Yeah, so it's interesting. For me personally, cognitively, I recognize that it's a dance between both. But when I think of where I am right now, grappling these issues are exhausting because, in terms of grappling with them in a community sense, it gets exhausting because I spend a lot of my, well, I'm not spending my time in any spaces right now, but when we were all outside the house, I spent most of my time in majority white spaces. And there's an exhaustion that comes with this undertone of, not necessarily everyone, but in some circumstances, there's this undertone where I feel like I'm being asked to prove something. And then even for people that, even for people in white spaces, white people in white spaces that I'm in that are doing their own work, they want to have conversations with me because there aren't a lot of me in those spaces. And then that becomes incredibly exhausting. And I feel like the undertone or the word that comes up for me, or that came up for me quite a bit in this conversation, is that negotiation, and having to really monitor how much I can or can't engage. And really having to stay connected with my current level of personal safety with how much I engage or don't engage. But I do think that it is important to have community and to engage in all of this with community present. And it brings me back to something Erica said earlier, actually. I have a friend that talks a lot about movement chaplaincy and resilience, and how important it is to preserve ourselves within the work. And Erica talked earlier about like the importance of being able to trust. And for me, it's allowing trust for other people to tap in so I can tap out. But currently, I would say that what's effective for me right now, it probably isn't always effective, but right now I'm just kind of like reclusing and trying to preserve my energy.
In saying that, thank you for engaging today. And actually, I thank all of you for being willing to engage. We got through all of those questions. Thank you for allowing your bravery to bear witness to what is the current reality and what is possible. I know the hour is far spent. We do have a couple of questions from the comment section that I would like for us to briefly address. Let's see. One of the questions, it was about safety. How do we incorporate safe space in the workplace? If anyone has a brief response to that, that would be lovely.
Yes, I'd like to share a thought on that. So prior to coming to divinity school, I was a corporate executive at a retail organization, and I spent a lot of time, moving up and progressing through kind of a professional career. And I think that, a person has to make a decision about what matters to them. And this gets to this whole piece about risk, right? So what's at stake when you begin showing up, talking about and challenging these systems that are at play? And oftentimes for Black people who challenge these systems that are at play, the risks are very, very, very great. And so, in a workspace, you may not be able to cultivate a safe space. Your workspace may not be the place where you're going to find people that you can have these kinds of conversations with. Even if your workspace is the place that you need most to be a transformed space because you spend so much time there and you experience so much trauma and so much harm in that space, you may have to resolve and understand that that's not going to necessarily be a space that you might consider a safe space, or a space that you can do this kind of work and have these kinds of conversations. And so if that is the case, right, that you spend the majority of your week, with those people in those places, and that place is not a safe space for you, and potentially that place is a place where you are experiencing, trauma and harm, I think you then have to figure out what are the systems that you need to put in place to sort of help you navigate through life under those circumstances, right? And that could range from having a great support system in place. Maybe it's a person you can text, girl, you don't know what she just said, to right, and kind of get some things off your chest in the moment as they're going down. Not necessarily bringing them and processing them in your workspace, but kind of processing them as they're happening. Or maybe it means finding a different workspace, a space that is not trauma filled for you, or a space that can be a safe space for you. So I guess my quick and initial answer to that question is, I don't know that you can necessarily transform every workspace into being a safe space. I think you have to understand the culture, the people, the organization, and then determine whether you feel like this is a place where you can do this work and have these conversations. And if not, you may be bringing more risk to yourself and more harm to yourself to try to press the issue, if it's not an environment that's accepting or welcoming of these kinds of conversations and topics and ideas.
Thank you.
I just wanted to say that, like, you handled that question so well, but that was so hard and so real. Like, to basically be like, look, you might not be safe. And like, that really is just the truth of the matter. And sometimes that safety might look like a percentage, like you might be 20% safe in this situation. I don't know, but that was real. And I appreciate you calling that out.
All right. Let's see. What is the best process for creating safe spaces to unpack and dismantle destructive narratives?
I don't have a best process, but I do have a few things to consider in that goal. And the first of those things is that unpacking and dismantling destructive narratives or internalized anti-Blackness or whatever it is not an overnight task. It's a long game. It's work that you have to do consistently and often. That it's something that we come back to. And the second is that sometimes, despite our best intentions in cultivating safe space, we expose trauma and we don't hold it well. And so to really think about, do I have the resources, whether that's the emotional resources, whether it's the resource of time, how our bodies show up in a space. It could be vocabulary or grounding techniques, but do I have the resources to keep people as safe as I can in a space? I don't really believe in the idea of doing no harm, but I think that we can always strive to do the least amount of harm. And so in that, I think time is something to really consider. And then the third is asking, have I done the work myself? Because sometimes we have some questions that we need to answer. We have some things we need to write out or exercise out or do whatever we do to get it out of our bodies before we can really hold safe space for other people.
I think too that it also, what comes to mind is who's asking the question. Because if it's a white person asking this question, I think that sometimes it looks like having the conversation amongst yourselves. Because I've been in rooms where white people are having conversations about dismantling destructive narratives, and I'm like one of 2 Black people in the room, and there are things that I just don't need to hear or be involved with. And then there's also that element of like, I'm in the room and it's awkward for the white people in the room, and then they're trying to negotiate because I'm bearing witness to their process, and I don't always need to be in the middle of that. So I think that if it is a white person asking this question, sometimes it's best to have the conversation amongst yourselves as to not create more harm for the Black people or people of color in your midst.
I think, excuse me, I think there's also something about knowing what safe feels like in your body and in your system, and being able to know what you would need in another space to also feel safe. That we've talked about sort of resources of when I have these resources present, I can handle this in this space. Or when I care for myself this way, then in this other space, I'm able to figure out maybe a different mode of care, but that can help me cultivate that similar feeling. And also sort of going back to Quentin's and Satoya's responses of like, sometimes the safe space is another space. That maybe, you know, your coworkers are having that conversation, that is not your space. And so like, I wouldn't create a safe space there anyway, because it's not meant for me. And I know that I can do that because I have felt what it feels like in other spaces, what it feels like to be safe. And I know that I'm not going to get that there.
Thank you. One last question from our comment section. A few of you have mentioned that sometimes you find yourselves or other Black folks you know perpetuating narratives of white supremacy and anti-Blackness. This is a real struggle, and I thank you for naming it. Have you discovered any helpful activities or questions or reflection exercises that you regularly engage with so as not to continue to perpetuate the narratives that you are actively trying to disrupt and dismantle? Any resources you could share?
So I'll say that one of the things that has helped me sort of fight my own internal anti-Blackness so that I don't recreate it in others is sort of finding, like, even looking into the little places where I've let anti-Blackness survive and that I know I can do some work on, like my bookshelf and how full of white authors it is, and how can I find new voices so that like I have new words to use as well, and that I'm just accustomizing myself to seeing Black authors on my shelf, so that I'm not, so that maybe when I see Black people in public, it's not so surprising, it's not so shocking, or adding into my playlist rotation new artists. And I find that the more artists I find, the more Black artists I discover, the more Black artists I discover, and that also has been really helpful for me in sort of finding places that I can control and that I can add back in the voices that have been deprived so far, so that I not only have new words to use, but that I'm just more used to it, and that helps me then recognize, oh, like this thing you just said, or this thing you're trying to do was about to perpetuate something that the song that you were just listening to supported you in making a new decision or something.
Yeah, I relate to that. I think that for me, it also involves like the authors and looking at my bookshelf and the people that I refer to as experts, the voices that I'm hearing. Honestly, one big thing for me that I mentioned earlier were my earrings. And I was born in the Bronx. And so we wear door knockers. That's part of that's what we do. It's a part of the culture. It's who we are. And so when I went to a lot of majority white spaces, I stopped wearing them because they seemed too aggressive. And so part of my way of disrupting and dismantling the narratives are to wear my door knockers, because they are authentically me and they authentically represent my culture and my expression of Blackness. And even asking myself, am I present enough in this moment to be my authentic self, regardless of the space that I'm in? And I think that's something that you might have to work through or discover within yourself as well, in your own expression of Blackness.
For me, there are two things I like to keep in mind. The first is that, white supremacy is connected to patriarchy, it's connected to heterosexism, it's connected to transphobia, it's connected to ableism, to all of these systems, right? One does not exist without the other in some part. And so it's helpful for me to think about it that way, because when I start to do the work in other places, I also should be doing the work of checking my own anti-Blackness. So that's the first part. And so that does, involve adding more books to my library, but also to be in relationship. I think relationship is the ultimate transformer of many things. And that doesn't mean that relationship transforms systems. But I do think that relationship transforms people. And so I want to make that distinction. The second part is there's this book that was written for white people, and it's called Dismantling Racism, a Workbook for Social Change Groups by Kenneth Jones and Tima Okun. And it's really, really, really helpful because it identifies aspects of white supremacy culture. And one of those for me is about achievement, right? And I was taught about achievement in terms of, you have to be the very best because you won't be seen as being as good. But I also was taught about achievement as this is the only way that you can prove yourself. And that is part of white supremacy culture, right? And so when I am disappointed because I get a 93 instead of a 100, it's not just me being my perfectionist self, it's also because I've internalized this narrative that what I do with my work is equal to my worth. There's others that are about mistakes, but I do recommend that book because it is a very helpful workbook, just even in terms of naming things that I didn't realize were connected. And then the third part is to normalize calling ourselves out and being accountable with one another, right? And so when I say something, to catch myself and to say, you know what, actually, in that moment, this is what I'm doing. Let me reframe how I said that, right? Because it practices what that feels like in my own flesh, and it practices it publicly, which I think is really important.
Sorry about that. I'm back. If I could add on, I would pick up where Erica left off with this notion of really monitoring yourself, right? One of the things I began to do was just listen to the negative thoughts or the negative speak that I had going on internally, whether it was about myself, whether it was about some other person, and really just began sort of challenging, where is this thought coming from? Why am I thinking this thought? Why am I standing in this place of judgment potentially of this person on this issue, whatever it looked like? and kind of looking at that negative place and that negative idea, and then asking myself, right, like, is this a love thy neighbor moment, right? Like, what, am I in this moment, right, thinking about this person in a way that is loving or affirming or recognizing that, them as a creation of God, or that God is being reflected in them and through them and all that they do. Um, so that's one thing for me. The second thing connected with that was this whole notion of kind of humanity, right? Like understanding that it is in our humanity that we do the most amazing things. And it is in our humanity that we do some of the most foul things. And so what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be fully human? And how do I not label someone because of their humanness, but just understand that they are in fact being a human being right now? Right. And kind of, again, checking myself, my motives, my judgments at that point in time. I think for me, perhaps the most important thing has been finding a community of people who are also doing this work, a community of people where I can ask these questions, who can call me out or in, depending on how you view that process. A community of people who love and appreciate the idea that we're pursuing, this notion of liberation for all people, specifically Black people in this moment in time, and a community of people who are willing to, again, create this safe space, a place where I can show up and be my full self, and I can be as ignorant as I am in any given moment in time, and be loved to a place of understanding and knowledge and wisdom. So for me, those are the ways that I try to do some of that work.
Thank you. Do we have any final thoughts?
I don't know if you answered it. There was one other question. I was not on the call for a moment, and that question was, where can folks find your music and support you and your work?
That. Well, my music is available everywhere to stream. I perform under my entire name, Karla Felecia Scaife. And the album, A Burning House, it will stream everywhere beginning Saturday, August the 1st. It is now available for pre-order on iTunes, Google Play, and Amazon. So if you would like to purchase instead of stream, I would greatly appreciate it. You can pre-order now, or you can purchase it when it comes out, or you can stream. But I do ask, if you do stream it, if you do purchase it, listen to it from beginning to the end. If you're on Amazon, Amazon jumbles up the order of the album. But if you use another platform, listen to it from beginning to end, because it is very much so a story. And you have to listen to it in context. Each thing flows from one point to the next. So thank you for reminding me to answer that question, because I conveniently forgot. Let me make sure we don't have, I think we have another question, our final question. Let's see. How often do you engage in educating and congregating with our community to assist in changing the narrative? If this question is specific to Musings from the Lighthouse, I've been blogging quite frequently lately. As far as this conversation series goes, this is the first installment, and hopefully we will be back next Thursday. If not next Thursday, we'll be back the week after that. And I will try my best to have different conversation partners each week with different topics, but all for the focus of dismantling empire within and without. So I hope that answers that question. If anybody else wants to talk about spaces where this kind of work happens that they're a part of, you're welcome to do so now.
So I would offer two things. So next week, Vanderbilt Divinity School and the Public Theology and Racial Justice Collaborative is holding almost a week-long event where these kinds of issues are going to be discussed by students, scholars, staff, academics. And so that can be a great place to go and learn. The event is free and open to the public. And I assure you that if you're interested in this topic and this kind of work, you will not be disappointed by attending the pieces of what's happening next week. Also, on the 14th and 15th of August, I'm participating in a conference called RACE, and it stands for Redefining American Church Expression to Restore Authentic Christian Evangelism. And if you're interested, that event, I want to say it may cost $25. But you can visit the mapexchange.net. That's map, M-A-P-P, exchange.net, and learn more information about that.
I have one of the online websites, I guess that's what it is, the website, that I really enjoy is called Beam Black Emotional and Mental Health Collective, and they often have host different forums. Like I went to one that was about writing for Black mental health, and it was a really wonderful collective space. It's not always the same collective of people. I don't think it's always the same host, but they have been doing some really wonderful work that I have been very grateful to participate in.
All right. Thank you again to our conversation partners for being so generous with their thoughts. And thank you to everyone that has joined in with us. Remember to like and follow Musings from the Lighthouse for more information on our upcoming conversations. Also, again, A Burning House will begin streaming everywhere on Saturday, August the 1st. So if all minds are clear, and as my daddy says, they never are, so we'll go home anyhow. We'll dismiss. Peace be with you.